Hey, welcome everyone to today's live stream. Pleasure to have you all on this stream. My name is Maurer. I work as a cloud advocate at Microsoft. Today we're going to talk about hybrid server management and how we can leverage Azure to manage our on-prem servers or servers running at the edge or running even at other cloud providers. And for that, we're going to use Azure Arc. So stay tuned. So as you can see, today we're streaming live from my home, and this is going to be a little bit different. This is not going to be the usual, like me presenting to you and just making sure, like, here's my presentation, my slide deck, I've prepared demos and all of that. This is really about having an interactive experience and really going through your questions and setting up things together, right? I really want to look what you're going to do and what your questions have, but we're going to do this very interactive. And again, I did not prepare much, to be honest. I'm just going to talk about Azure Arc for servers. Now, again, before I start talking a bit about it, is like, why do we actually need something like this, or why would we actually leverage something like this? And for that, I really want to quickly explain a couple of things before we dive into it. And I'm sure many of you in the call that you already know why we're going to use this. But if you look at today's environment, if we are IT operations and we need to take care of our environments, we need to manage servers on-prem, we need to manage servers in the cloud. We need to manage servers at other cloud providers, right? And environments really get increasingly complex. So you have IT administrators have apps, like they manage usually like hundreds or even thousands of different applications, and some of them, they can be fairly new apps, right? They can be containerized apps, these can be PaaS apps, and they can be, for example, running on serverless. But then we also have our traditional apps, like our traditional applications. They run on virtual machines and they run on physical machines. And guess what? They're not going away. They're going to be there for quite a while, and we need to find a way to manage that a little bit more efficiently. Another large challenge we can see is that you have that large, diverse infrastructure, right? Usually, probably companies have multiple data centers, they have branch offices, they run servers in stores or their factories to basically run their applications, right? So this is also a challenge. You need to manage all of these. And then the large challenge, the third one basically, is really about when it comes to multi-cloud, because we are seeing customers, even though they decide to use Azure as their primary cloud provider, which is, by the way, a very good decision. But we see that there are reasons out there why customers are, for example, in a hybrid cloud environment. It can be that they or a multi-cloud environment. That it can be that they already started using another cloud provider before Azure, and they're not just going to migrate everything over to Azure, or they have a strategy or an architecture which they decided to also use other cloud providers. So everything gets increasingly complex, right? And we need to have a little bit of a tooling to make this easier. And if you look at Azure, kind of like when Azure started, we also realized, we as Azure customers, we realized managing cloud pieces is hard, right? There are many pieces we need to manage in our cloud environment. There are like servers, there are like different networks we need to manage, and we need to keep the control of all of that. And that is where we started using or built something called the Azure Resource Manager, and I will talk a little bit about that in a bit. But these capabilities Azure Resource Manager provides us, like subscription management, tags, policies, logs, and all those good management technologies, are pretty helpful to us, right? So they are helping us to manage our cloud resources in Azure. Now, people are asking, okay, hey, this is great. Why can we not just use this for our on-prem servers as well, or for our servers running in another cloud provider? And I have to admit, when I'm talking about hybrid, I don't just mean our servers on-prem or in Azure. I also include servers on the edge, or talking about servers running at service providers or other cloud providers, right? Just to make that sure, because I'm going to use that word a lot in that chat. So what we actually have is a tool like Azure Arc, which exactly should help us managing these resources. So let's have a look quickly here at Azure Arc, and I'm switching to our website here, and I quickly want to go through. Again, I promised no slides, so that's why I'm using the website here quickly. And you can see here, like, you get an introduction to Azure Arc, and as I said, like the different environments. When you have Azure, you have multi-cloud environments, you have the edge, you have on-prem, and you basically can manage all of that at one single place. So if we look at the use cases, what Azure Arc can do, and again, Azure Arc can do a couple of things, and we don't have time in that presentation to talk about all of that. We're really going to talk about the first part here: organize and govern Windows servers and Linux servers across different environments, right? So we're really going to focus about this one, but Azure Arc can do more, right? So we already announced that it can, for example, manage Kubernetes clusters which are running outside of Azure, and that you can deploy like Azure services, like Azure Data Services, to your on-prem environment, or even, again, to other cloud providers as well. So Azure Arc can do really a lot, but to make that example, I really want to start with this part here, and that is one we're going to have a look at, because this is also the one which is today in public preview, which you can actually try out. We at Build announced, by the way, also the Kubernetes piece now, which was in private preview. You can also go out and try that out right now. It's not in the portal yet, but you have like the PowerShell APIs and things like that. So with that, let me quickly see if we have anything in the chat. There are many people, by the way, in the chat, which is awesome. Hi, Sam, Karsten, Andrew, and all of the other people I already said hi. So great that you're all here. But let me talk now about managing Azure resources. And I told you that we already have great management tools in Azure, right? We have like these tools, and I'm going to show you here. For example, I can list all my resources in Azure, and it lists all my resources and objects, like you can see here: firewalls, public IP addresses, virtual machines. They then are grouped and managed basically inside resource groups. They're connected to a location, like an Azure region, and they're basically sitting in a subscription. I can also use tags for these resources, so I can do that and can basically organize them the way I want it. Now, tags are a very efficient way of managing stuff. So you can also go and like basically tag all the resources, and then you can use them in places like cost management. So you can have, like, let's say, a department tag, which you're going to use, and then you go into cost management, and then you can list all resources and all the costs for the resources which have that specific department tag, for example, so you can see which department spent how much on different resources. So that is like, and again, there are many more tools, and I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with these. But now people are telling us, hey, this is great. I can manage like really a lot of different resources, and Azure is basically very effective in doing that. So why can we not just use this to manage resources outside of Azure? And that's what I want to show you in this quick demo here. So before we're going to set this up, I quickly want to show what we can actually do, because I've onboarded already a couple of servers using Azure Arc to show you how it looks like. But then later on, we will go and see how we actually onboard a server to Azure Arc, and then what we can actually do. So let's have a look what we can do with these servers. So what I want to do here, make it a little bit easier. I just want to see in my list here my Azure VMs as well as my Azure Arc servers. Those are servers running outside of Azure. They can be on-prem. Most of my servers are running here behind me on that little nuke, but they can obviously run wherever they are, right? Data centers, different locations. They can also run at other cloud providers. So I'm going to select these. And now you can see here all the different servers. So what you can see here, you can see my Azure virtual machines next to my servers running them in my own data centers, right? And you can see here that, for example, my file server here is an Azure Arc machine. It's also joined to a resource group. It is located in a or connected to an Azure region. It is in a Azure subscription, and it can use tags. So for example, here I use the location tag to say, hey, there's different locations. So I have a server in the Seattle office, one in the New York data center, and so on. So I can do that. I can use the same tools basically I know from Azure and can manage my on-prem servers as well. Now, using tags, for example, I promised you to show you quickly how I could, for example, add filters and stuff like that. So let's just say I want to know all my servers which belong to a specific cost center. So what I did, I used a cost center tag, and let's say I want to list all of the servers running in cost center 1001. Since I only have one here, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm gonna list these, and you can see here now that I have my Azure VM, which belongs to that cost center, but also my on-prem machine here listed as well. So it helps me very quickly get an overview about the resources I'm running here. And obviously, I'm not just using these, like I'm showing you that in the portal, but obviously you can also use tools like PowerShell, CLI, or for example, the Azure Resource Graph to basically get these information together. They could even build dashboards, for example, on your Azure dashboard. Now, you'd probably say now, Thomas, okay, I mean, come on, this is not the fancy thing, right? This is not necessarily like that great. You just connected servers and they now show up here. Yes, so what we can obviously also do now, we get a couple of these management tools we can use in Azure, right? So we can now take advantage of these management tools to manage these resources. So let's go and have a look at, for example, policy, because that's one of the first one which is enabled in Azure Arc, which we can actually have a look at. And so let me, before we show this, let me quickly talk about what policy actually is. So policy allows us to configure the Azure environment, right? We can basically set rules for the Azure environment, and we can make sure that, for example, like developers can only deploy to a certain specific region, or that we can only deploy to only deploy a certain size of VMs, or excuse me, we don't assign public IP addresses. Now the interesting part about this, and you can see because I'm just drinking, this is really live. So the interesting part is the policy help us to keep actually control over our environment without giving up the speed of the cloud, right? That's one of the parts Azure policy can do. But together with Azure guest configuration policies, we can also manage the operating systems. And when we start managing the operating systems, we can set certain rules and make sure that our VMs are configured in a secure way. So with that, I want to quickly show you here how that can look like. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is something we could use for Azure VMs for quite a while. So I go to assignments here, for example. Again, I don't want to go too deep into the policy stuff. I just want to make that example, right? So if you're not familiar with it, we can certainly have a talk afterwards what we can actually do. So I currently already have a couple of assignments here. Those are basically saying, hey, this policy is assigned to that specific subscription or resource group and so on. So if I create a new one, I can then select what's the scope, where to like on which subscription or on which management group or on which resource group I actually want to assign this. And then we have already some definitions built in. And if I want to make sure, for example, that all my servers have a secure password setting, I can go out and audit, for example, VMs with insecure password settings, right? So I can figure out, hey, which of my Azure VMs are currently not configured secure. Yeah, Benjamin, unfortunately not thirsty, but something is in my throat and I don't want to cough into the microphone. So I want to be nice to all of you, but thank you. So Yes, so this helps us really to figure that out. So what I did, I already configured that. So let me go back. And I can now have a look here on the compliance to like how is actually my state. And you can see here some of my policies I'm not compliant, and hopefully if I scroll down, there are also some policies which I am compliant, right? So I'm like, okay, all my resources are compliant with this. And again, this can be like my Azure environment, my configuration of my web apps or databases and so on. But this can also be with Azure guest configuration policy in the operating system itself. And if I look here, I already assigned this policy here to audit VMs with insecure password policies. Now, again, this is not new. This is there for Azure VMs for quite a while now. But the interesting part is here. So if I scroll down, I see the different policies which I'm not compliant, and then the ones which I am compliant. But I can now see the non-compliant resources. So if I go to that, I can see now my Azure VMs as I could before. But now with Azure Arc, I can also see my on-prem servers or servers running at other cloud provider as well, right? So I can basically audit all my password settings across all my servers wherever they are running to give you that point. And in some tasks, then I can go out and even create a remediation task to make sure that this VM then is set up correctly. So with that, the question really becomes, how do we now actually onboard these servers, right? How do we actually add these to our system, and how do we actually manage Azure Arc? And before I'm going to show you this, I want to quickly show you my environment here, which we're going to use for the demo, if I can. That's great. Okay, perfect. So I have a Hyper-V server here, as you can see, with a couple of virtual machines. Those names are probably familiar to you. I already onboarded a couple of these servers to my Azure environment. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to add that SQL server here. Well, basically it's just a server which hopefully in the future will have a SQL server on it. I didn't have time to install the SQL server, but it also doesn't matter for our setup here. So we are quickly going back to the Azure portal, and obviously I would go to Azure Arc. Now, I mentioned to you before when we went to the website, we cannot just manage servers, right? There's like servers is one part of this, but there's also the possibility to manage Kubernetes clusters, kind of like in the same way. So we also have policies, for example, to manage these Kubernetes clusters which run outside of Azure. Or then deploy Azure data services like Azure SQL on-prem or at other cloud providers or wherever we want them, which is great. Because that is one of the feedbacks we had also from customers was, hey, we love Azure SQL, we love the scaling and all that, like kind of like that principle of having like databases as a service, but some of them can't really run in Azure, right? We don't like the region is too far away, so we have too much network latency for our applications, or we have compliance reasons which do not allow us to use an Azure region outside of our country and things like that. So enough about the other Azure Arc pieces. We're actually going to manage servers. So what I'm going in here, I'm going to see here my servers I already onboarded. You can see here I have a couple of them. Those were the same ones you just saw. But now if we want to add that SQL server, what we're going to do is we simply click on Add. Now we can now see that we have a couple of different things here to add one of these machines. And these machines basically, there are two options right now. One is an interactive script. This script will basically go out and we run that script, and then basically we need to log in, and that's what I'm going to show you in a bit. But obviously if we want to onboard servers at scale, we need some sort of better automation because we don't want to log in to Azure in every single server when we deploy an agent. So there's also an option where we can use a service principal name basically to onboard servers at scale, and then basically just give enough permissions that the only thing that Service Principal can do is basically onboard servers to Azure Arc. But we are going to install that script here using that interactive script right now, because that for one server that's much easier to do. So let's go through that wizard, and the wizard really helps us build us like that script, right? It's not designed to basically go out and do everything by itself, but it helps us building that. So as you know, for every Azure resource, yeah, Nuno, yeah, I need more RAM, definitely. Unfortunately, it's not too much. It's like 32 gigs, which I have there on my nuke. But Hyper-V has a crazy good feature called dynamic memory, which basically allows you to like use less memory if the VM is doing nothing. And most of my VMs are doing nothing. So yeah, so if we want to onboard that, we basically have different options here. So we need to join it to a subscription. Like every Azure resource, basically they belong to a subscription. We need to add it to a resource group. So I already prepared one here. It's called the Azure Arc VMs resource group. And then I also need to join it to a region. And currently, I remind you, we are in public preview. So we have right now 4 regions available for you to choose. Again, this is part of the preview, right? I get this question a lot. Is this like limited in the future for this region? No. This is just for during the preview, right? So we have Western Europe here. And then we choose what type of operating system we're going to onboard, because obviously different scripts, different commands, depending if it's Linux or Windows. So in our case, we're going to onboard a Windows machine. And then if my VMs would, or my server would be behind a proxy, I could also configure that in the script, in the agent. And then I can already add tags here. So I can add tags later, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to add them right now. So if I go back here, I can basically review and download the script. But to be honest, it's very, very simple. It's just downloading the agent. That's the first step. Then installing that agent, and then registering that server to that specific Azure tenant, and then in that subscription, and then in that resource group. So that is what we're going to do. So I copy that script, and I will go back to my SQL Server VM here. So here's my SQL Server. And you can see here just a simple Windows server running right behind me here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that script. And now, yeah, let's just paste and see what happens. So the first part, downloading that agent, then installing that agent in the background. And this will take a moment to complete. So I have a couple of questions while this is installing. I will quickly add some questions in a bit. The last part really is about registering that server. So I'm going to register that. And now it tells me, okay, I need to use device login. And that is where usually the service principal part comes into play if you're doing that at scale, right? So you want to automate that part. So for this, I'm just going to use that and quickly go back. And I need to verify. I could also log in on this machine, but since I don't want have my credentials on all my machines, so I just use my management machine here to basically log in. Okay. Use my Microsoft account here. And now you can see here, this basically that we logged in. If I now go back to my SQL Server, we should see that the script, come on, that the script should be finishing. So we need a moment here. Just give it back. Perfect. Okay. So we will see here in a second that will complete and the server will be registered to my Azure environment. Now, quickly want to answer a couple of questions here. So let me switch here. Quickly do my camera here. because they had a couple of questions. So yes, Hyper-V is very cool, Karsten. I agree. How much memory I'm hiding? Again, only 32 gigs. Any plans to integrate Azure Bastion with VM managed by Azure Arc? This is a very interesting question. To be honest, I don't know. I heard that feedback a lot, and it's something we could bring back to the Azure Arc team and tell them, hey, look, that we heard that a lot, so that people want to use Bastion for their on-prem machines, right? So that's definitely something we're going to have a look at. But I don't know if it's on the roadmap or anything. We currently don't talk about that much about the roadmap, what is coming. But we have some interesting features in the pipeline, which were basically feedback from our customers. They said, hey, we want to use this feature and that feature, and then the team could use that feedback to prioritize. Is this agent the same as the SCOM agent? That's a good one. So no, this is a new Azure Arc connected agent. And since we are live, I'll quickly show you this. So this installs, let's go to uninstall, a Azure Connected Machine Agent. And this one will basically do the connection with the Azure Resource Manager. And I will show you that just in a bit. So let me quickly log in here. And let me quickly whiteboard this out for you. So what we are actually doing here is, again, we are installing an agent on my machine, on our machines, to basically leverage Azure and connected it to Azure. So when we are basically, we as Azure customers, and I hope you can see that. So here we are. That's us, our Azure customer. Probably I should do my hair a little bit like this usually. So I hope that's better. When we are interacting with Azure, we are basically using a couple of different ways. So what I'm using, or what we as customers use, is usually the portal. We can use the CLI. We can use PowerShell, or we could use like different APIs and so on, right? So that is basically what we are using to then interact, what I mentioned before, what is, and I need to be careful here a little bit with the space. So what we call the Azure Resource Manager. Now, this is basically the magic behind everything which comes to management, like subscriptions, tags, and so on. So I'll quickly do that, like tags, policy, subscriptions, logs, for example, and much more, right? So that is all. This is the magic piece, which usually was there to manage all our, let me zoom that in a little bit. So usually what we had here, this was here to manage now all our Azure resources, right? So, and sorry for my handwriting, it's definitely not great, but you get the point. So I could use like, VMs, databases, app service, and all the Azure, the specific Azure resources. And that was great to use that, right? So we were able to basically use that to use Azure Resource Manager to manage all the Azure resources. Now what Azure Arc does, we are basically extending, and I will look through this, extending Azure Resource Manager here with Azure Arc to add other resources which are outside of Azure. And today we announced that this can be like servers. I say VMs, but this can also be physical servers as well. It can be Kubernetes clusters, or it could be data. I just call it data for now, but that could be Azure Data Services. So that is what we can actually connect today, or what we announced today, what we can do. And this is basically an agent which then communicates with the Azure Arc APIs, which then basically builds the bridge between your on-prem systems and Azure Resource Manager. You see what I did there with bridge? So this is a very specific agent here we just installed for our environment. This is not the existing monitoring agent we use. This is the Azure Connected Machine agent that we have for servers. There's one also for Kubernetes clusters again, and we have different systems for the data services part. But again, this is all about server management today, so we're going to talk about that. Yes, so I saw a couple of other questions. Install the agent, Windows Server behind the proxy. Yes, that is supported. You can do that, absolutely. So you can basically go out and configure the proxy server. I was probably a little bit fast when I explained this, but that is what you can do. So then we also have, where would the Azure Arc Agent need to be installed? So the Azure Arc Agent, so if it's a Kubernetes cluster, it's basically on top of this Kubernetes cluster. So it's very smartly done. It's not something, there's an onboarding documentation for the Kubernetes clusters. And if we have time at the end, we can also look at this. But again, we're focusing a little bit on server today. So this is how we get the server installed already with Azure Arc. Now what I'm going to do here is I go back to my management machine. And if I talked enough time, which was, by the way, not the plan, if I go now back to machines and I give it a refresh, and again, this is live, so I'm giving it a refresh. And now you can see here, as I said, that my SQL server here now shows up in Azure. And now I can start managing that server in Azure. However, that's probably not that interesting yet because, again, it needs some time to get all the policy information in and so on. But I have a couple of other machines which you can now take as an example. So how does that look like now? So if I go on one of my machines here, you can see that this now looks like an Azure resource, right? This is really now, I added it to a resource group, it's to a location, it's joined to a subscription. And I can go and add tags now. I can go and say, okay, hey, I want to properly add another tag. So for example, what did I say? Cost center. So I could add a cost center, or I could, for example, add a new cost center. So I can save this. And then I can basically use the same capabilities I used for the Azure MEMs as well. You can also see I get an activity log and I get access control. So I get role-based access. Now, the problem with a lot of the Azure services, which already support hybrid, that was like, for example, like if you think about update management or log analytics, which is a very good example, is that you could already onboard on-prem machines today to Azure Log Analytics. However, when you did that, you basically needed to give all the people who accessed the logs from that server access to the Azure Log Analytics workspace, and they would see all the other logs from all the other servers as well. And that's not something you want to do. Now with Azure Arc, we can actually get that role-based access. So instead of giving people access to the Log Analytics workspace, we just give them access to the Azure Arc server in Azure, or the Azure Arc machine. And now they can just manage that server using the Azure management tools. So you can see here I have a couple of properties, I have logs, and I quickly want to show you the policy part because that was something I showed you before. So if I go to policy, you can now see here all the policies which are assigned to just that specific server. So this is not something which like before we saw like all the policies for my whole environment, which I applied to all the servers, but now this is like what is really assigned to my server. So I can see here a lot of policies which I'm compliant, that's great, but then also a couple of them which I'm not compliant. And if I'm now a server admin, I would go out and basically check and see, hey, okay, I'm not compliant with that. So that's auditing VMs with insecure password security settings. So let me see what's actually wrong. And then in that initiative, I can see all the stuff, all the policies here, which I'm there. And I can see here, most of them, my server is compliant, which is great because it's a default installation. So I hope most of it is compliant. But then there's some certain features which I'm not compliant, or certain policies which we see, hey, you should configure that. then you can basically go out and change these settings for that specific machine. So let me quickly switch back here to see what else do we have in the chat. So here we go. Oh, some new people joined. That's great. Is there a push agent installation? Well, so if you want to install the agent, we give you the MSI file, we give you the install command, and we give you the registration command. So if you have a tool to basically push this out to your machine, you can actually do that if you wanted to. When you have like some software, like a tool which manages the software on certain machines, then you can basically go out of that. By the way, that's a good point. This is only designed, or Azure Arc really is meant to be, as I mentioned, for server and Kubernetes clusters, not really for clients, right? If you want to manage clients, then this is something which you probably want to look at Microsoft Intune and stuff like that, because that is actually our cloud management for client devices or mobile devices and so on. So you could use that. There's some like David, I think you can push it via MACM. Yeah, so if you have, for example, configuration manager or something in place, you could basically go out and do that as well. No worries, I will show you, by the way, a little bit more about what we can actually do now with that machine in a bit. But I just want to really answer your questions here. Another interesting question which we get a lot is, how does Azure Arc now compare to Azure Stack? So those are absolutely like two different cases, right? So obviously they're both products which address hybrid needs for our customers, but they're like really addressing different needs. So if you, for example, Azure Stack is really where, like Azure Stack Hub, for example, comes in, is where you have no connectivity, where you have a disconnected environment, but you still want to use these Azure services, or where you have not really reliable connectivity and you want to use Azure services, or where you have regulations which don't allow you to go out and use Azure data centers or Azure regions. That is also a very good case. And then the last one is really where you want to deploy stuff on-prem, but you want to use that cloud deployment model. You want to use ARM templates, for example. You want to use like all the benefits the Azure Resource Manager provides you without having that dependencies necessarily to Azure. And Azure Arc really allows you to just like extend the Azure Resource Manager from Azure to your on-prem environment. And again, those are two separate solutions, but you can also combine them in a way, right? So think about like a Kubernetes cluster on Azure Stack Hub connected to Azure Resource Manager using Azure Arc, for example. So they can also play very well together. They're not there where like it's not one or the other. It really depends on what use case do you have for these. So it's a very good question because we get this a lot, because now people are asking like, why one or the other. Okay, so let's go on. I want to show you a little bit more here. And what I want to show you is, now I onboarded that server. I want to show you something more. Now I was speaking about the log analytics part, right? So again, if I now want to see all the logs, I basically installed the MMA agent, like the monitoring agent, on these machines. And now the problem is, if I just want to give someone access to these logs, they needed to go to the log analytics workspace, and they had basically more or less full access to all the logs. Now with Azure Arc, I can just give someone access to that specific machine. And if we click on logs here, I can now see the logs for that specific server here, right? So I can see here, this is now the log analytics view, but limit the scope basically to my server here. And you can see here I can have different logs. If you're not familiar with log analytics, I get a lot of different logs I can get in from that agent and get all that information. One of my favorite ones is really the update management. So I can create a query here using the keyword query language, or formerly known as maybe as Custo for some of you. So I could run here that query against that server. and then I get a list of all the updates which are installed or which are needed for that specific system. And you can see here, this system here, this server has a couple of updates needed. I get all this information here about this system, and then I can go out and do something about it. For example, using Azure Update Management to address this. So those are some of the features we have currently in Azure Arc for servers. Again, with policy and Azure Guest Configuration policy, you can do quite a lot of things. With log analytics, we can run all the log queries, and you can also see, you could also see the log information while the server is, for example, offline, right? For example, you have shaky internet or whatever, you don't have a connection to that server, you don't have a VPN to a server running in that branch office or running at that specific store, for example, but you want to check the logs and you will find out what do I need to do, what do I need to install, then you basically get that information. Now, the great thing is now I know about this specific updates. So what I already did, I went to Azure Update Management, which I can find in my automation account under Update Management. And now I can see here all my servers which I have onboarded. So this is also, again, nothing new. This is already exists for a while, where I can use it for my Azure machines, but also for my on-prem machines. So for example, you can see here my server here, which I just showed you, is not compliant. So what I could simply do, for those who are not familiar with Azure Update Management, I could just go and create a new scheduled update deployment. So I give it a name. Let's just call it this time patch my Arc server, for example. Again, you would obviously do something a little bit more professional than that, but I can then go out and say, hey, okay, I want to now patch Windows machines or Linux machines. So this is a Windows machine, so I'm going to stick with that because that is something which obviously changes a couple of options here in the wizard. But again, it works also great with Linux machines as well. So what I can basically go now is, like, I could go out and select a couple of machines. I could, for example, select a group, but in our case, we really want to go and just select a specific machine here. So I'm just going to select that one machine. But again, in production, you would probably go for groups. So I'm selecting that machine. I can then go out and basically say which update classifications I want to install. I can include, exclude updates. I could basically then go out and schedule this update. So the great thing is this will go out and then install updates on this machine, but I can do that also as a recurring task. So I could go out and say, hey, I want, like, every Tuesday you go out and install the patches on that machine. And again, I could use groups, and with these groups I could even use like tags and say, hey, every VM with a specific tag, or every machine here with a specific tag, you could basically go out and patch. You can then, so I'm just going to select one time now. I'm not going to run it anyway, but then I can select some pre or post script. So if you need to stop some services or run something after the update, you can do that as well. And then you can basically go out and say, hey, when the updates are installed, do you want me to reboot? Usually reboot if required sounds like a good option, but you can also say always reboot, or you can also say never reboot. And so with that, you can then create that job. I'm not going to do that. And this will then run through and go out and patches the servers you just selected, right? In that case, it would just been one, but you can basically go out and do that. So let's quickly switch back here to a couple of more questions, because that is why we are here. So we also have a question about metrics. Today it's really about logs, but we heard the feedback a lot that people also want to see some metrics of the VMs, for example, to onboard Azure monitoring. Right now we have Azure monitoring for on-prem machines, so you can basically connect them, just not visible right now in the Azure Arc solution. So this is something which maybe the team is thinking of. They definitely heard that feedback as well, but we will see what is coming there. What about backups for servers managed by Azure? So Jonathan, that's a really good question. So what we have already is Azure Backup. And so Azure Backup currently is not part of Azure Arc, but you can download a Azure Backup agent and basically install it on your machines. These can be clients and servers, and it basically leverages Windows Server Backup in the background, but then moves the backup to Azure in a recovery vault. You can also install the Azure Backup Server. So this is a free server you can download. You can basically go out and back up all your on-prem machines to that specific server, and then the long-term backups will be moved to Azure in that case. And the Azure Backup Server also supports application backups for example, like SharePoint server, SQL, Exchange, and so on. So that's probably something which is very interesting for that. Can we do management of VMs shutdown restart from the Azure portal? Yeah, so this is this is not something they implemented, but when I went down here in the features list, so this is what a little bit further, I think I found it today. So when we have management here of VMs here, we can have a couple of options here. Again, it manages Linux VMs and Windows VMs, VMs in different clouds. So let me quickly switch here again so you can also see what I mean. This is on the Azure Arc page. And so you can see here I can manage Linux, Windows VMs, virtual machines, bare metal, other cloud provider, completely domain agnostic. We get that search, that scalable search inventory, which I just showed you before. But here, this one is interesting. So it says consistent VM extensions for agent management. Now, this is not something you actually deal with, right? This is not something a lot of you are probably familiar with, except when you deploy a VM in Azure, we have a guest agent installed in that VM. And that's not a secret, you know that is there. But this allows you to basically like use features in the portal again, like policy, Azure Backup, monitoring, and all that to basically interact with that Azure VM. Now, with the Azure Arc Agent, that Azure Connected Machine Agent, and saying here, okay, we have a consistent VM extension, that meaning that we can basically take the same extensions as we wrote or the teams have written for Azure VMs. We can basically take them more or less in the same way and basically add these to Azure Arc VMs. So this is not something I think we are like promoting heavily, but this is like how the backend works, right? What is in the backend. It's not something you can leverage today for yourself, but it's something which how the agents, like for example for policy or logs today work. So they can work in a similar fashion as they do in Azure. And so that makes it much easier for teams to basically use the same APIs, if you will, because it's a consistent experience. And I think there's a very good talk back at Ignite. If you look at the Ignite video where the team is talking a little bit about that, a little bit more about the agent and how it works in the background and what actually the benefit of that is. So let me quickly go back to my front camera here. So we have a couple of things. Azure Arc in previews, cost. So Azure Arc, yes, is currently in Azure Arc is currently in public preview for the server piece, and I think we are still in private preview for the data services part, and we just announced, I think, the public preview of the Kubernetes part. So if you're looking for the documentation, you will find this. Let me quickly have a look here. So we're quickly going Azure Arc for servers. And then we have some documentation here. So again, for the costs today, we do not add any cost specific, or we did not really talk about pricing yet for the Azure Arc piece. What there definitely will be costs if you activate log analytics and stuff like that, that will obviously cost you the logs today, but the team did not share anything on pricing until today. So to answer a couple of questions here, so if you want to start that, if you want to do the same thing, we have some great documentation here, which explains a little bit of the different scenarios. So today, again, the things I showed you, which are currently supported, our policy and log analytics. And then we have a couple of regions here which are in the supported list. I see there's one missing. Maybe we should add that as well. And then we have a couple of information here. So let me show you how about connecting the agent. So here we have, again, the documentation, how it's installed and how that would work. You find all the information about that specific agent. You can also see the different processes which will run on that machine to get some more information out there. And then you can also see how you actually going to manage that. There are also some limitation documentations, and if I'm going to the right place, so let me quickly check. Connect machines from the... Oh, that was actually what I want to show you. So here we have some of the currently supported operating systems. Again, think about that we are still in preview. These are the ones we are currently supporting in the preview time frame, right? So maybe if you have wishes, if you have like requirements for others, give us that feedback so we know, okay, hey, that is actually something people want or need. We can actually have a look at this. So again, there's also how you configure like agent traffic. There's also something interesting which I got a lot of questions on, is like, this is an outbound connection, right? It's going over HTTPS to certain Azure APIs, and that are, this one here are the APIs which the agent needs to connect to. So we give you that information. Again, this all is outgoing traffic. There's nothing coming in, no configuration on your side on the firewall in that case needed. And this is basically how you onboard that machine here. So let me go back here. How does telemetry work? So again, you can find that in the documentation file there in the docs to basically go out and say, hey, what is going on? So then we can have an agent communication via express route to Azure Arc. So yeah, this is a good one. So the question is actually, can you have an agent communication via express route through Azure Arc? So I don't think we have spoken about it. To be honest, I need to check, but I guess that should be possible. If you do the peering, the express route peering part, I don't see why this connectivity should not go over that, right? With like, so when you do an Azure Express route, you can basically have like the private connectivity one, which is kind of like the same experience as you would do a site-to-site VPN to your Azure VMs, but you can also use it for peering. So if you speak to public APIs of Azure, you're also going over that express route. And I don't see a reason why Azure Arc should not use that route. However, I haven't tested it. I haven't really read the documentation on it yet, but I guess it is supported, but definitely something to check out. Thank you, Sam, for that question. Then there's also interesting, and do so, user Windows Admin Center. So I haven't missed the first part of that. But so yes, Windows Admin Center obviously is also there. Again, great tool. I also use it here on my machine. If you're looking at it, it's not there, like Azure Arc and Windows Admin Center do not replace each other, right? They're not there to like say, hey, one is the other or the other one. Windows Admin Center even has in the settings of a server, you can even go and configure Azure Arc. So in the background, you just say, hey, I want to onboard that server. You connect, you again select the subscriptions and everything in the wizard. Actually, let me show you this. So if I'm going, and this is really off script now because again, we are live, right? So what I can do here, let me go quickly to my Windows Admin Center server here. If it fails, I will just basically say it's your fault. But so here we are on my Windows Admin Center server. And the only thing I actually want to show you is that Windows Admin Center has an integration for Azure Arc. So if I'm now going to, let's say, go to that Hyper-V VM, that Hyper-V server, because that one I haven't onboarded yet. So again, this is just the normal management, you know, from Azure Windows Admin Center. So what I could go is I could go down to settings, and then in settings you find Azure Arc for servers. And if you go here, you can go and get started. And I'm not sure if I'm logged in here, but the idea is that you then can go here to you get the wizard we just had before. We can select the subscription. We can create, select the resource group here. As I did before, we can select the region. And then we could configure the proxy if we need to. That was, by the way, the question I had before. Can it be behind the proxy? Yes. So in that case, you would just configure the proxy. And if you click on setup, Windows Admin Center will go out, download the agent for you, install the agent, and register your server to the right machine here. So that is another one I wanted to quickly show you as well. So going back to the questions here. So in most cases, on-prem servers are isolated and without internet access. Is there any? Yes. So Alexander, this is a very good point. There are obviously servers which do not have internet connectivity, right? Where you have on-prem systems which are blocked to use the internet. Now, again, since we have an agent communication, we can't really do it without having that basically communication right now. So if you're behind a proxy, that is not a problem as long as the proxy allows you to go pass through this. If not, I would love to know a little bit more about that. So I guess what you want maybe is something like a gateway where all the servers connect to, and then they send up data to Azure or something like that. So that's something maybe we should check. But I'm absolutely happy to learn more about your requirement there. So Thomas, how to control the data which is going out? So again, you can go through a proxy, right? If you want to keep control of your environment, you can go and configure a proxy in front of that and basically control it using that specific setting. If you don't have a proxy today and you don't have, you basically give the server internet access anyway, basically the only limit there is the firewall, which you probably have a little bit of control there. But that's basically it. It's not something you would do on the machine itself. So you would probably put it on your network gateway or your firewall, which you would put there, in my opinion. To be sure, I can also back up the on-prem VM because the extension is already inside. Today, really, the backup is not part of the Azure Arc solution yet, so it's really just going out and creating the backup vault and downloading the backup agent, right? But I'm really happy. Again, I hear backup a lot, and I will definitely pass that feedback to the group there. So that is what I had. And what I also want to quickly share, because we had a couple of Kubernetes questions. So let me quickly go to my management machine here. I quickly want to show you the documentation. Azure Arc. And then if we scroll down, here we go. So the documentation is already online for Azure Arc enable for Kubernetes clusters. So let me quickly switch that here. So on Microsoft Docs, you can find that if you quickly use Bing, like the best search engine in the world. You can basically go out and find this article if you just use for Azure Arc Kubernetes. And then you will find that documentation here, how you actually go out and connect a cluster here. And this will go through with you, like how you do that, what are the requirements to do that for the same thing. Basically, I just showed you for server, but doing the same thing for a Kubernetes cluster. Now, again, Azure Arc for Kubernetes cannot just do policies. Like policy is one thing, but the other thing really is about app deployment. Now, what that means is that I can actually go out and say, hey, I want to point my Kubernetes cluster to a Git repository. And then when I do changes and check in code there, it automatically goes out and deploys this on my Kubernetes cluster. So this is using a technology called like GitOps to basically do that. And so it's a very effective way of getting that DevOps mentality basically, and also use that over basically a centralized control plane using Azure for not just your Azure Kubernetes service clusters, your AKA clusters, but also Kubernetes clusters which are running on-prem or at other cloud providers. And this also, by the way, works with OpenShift, right? I think we just recently had a blog post with Red Hat where we said, okay, hey, how we actually collaborate on this, on our hybrid story with Azure Stack, but also, for example, with Azure Arc, right? So, good. Can you see this session again? Yes, so this is like a recording, and so far I didn't screw it up too much. So I will definitely have this stay on YouTube, so you can basically watch the recording. I think it always takes a couple of minutes to basically after we finish that stream. With that, I really want to say thank you very much for being today on the live stream. Really happy that everyone who joined, and I hope I see you in another one in the future. If you like this, please just like the video, subscribe to my channel, and you will get like notified when I go online the next time. So thank you very much. See you soon.